the general public. That's why we deemed it fit to call you in on this special day and take you through the steps that led to the signing of a concession agreement with a firm from Turkey called Al Barak for the improvement of the port of Banjul and the construction of a new deep sea port in Sanyang. Just to give a little bit of a background, the port of Banjul has been inundated with growth in traffic to the extent that the facility cannot accommodate the increased volume, which has led to congestion, particularly more serious during the past few years. The need for infrastructure improvement at the port of Banjul has been highlighted way back in 2002 when a master plan was commissioned and was prepared by Hamburg Port Consulting of Germany. But due to lack of financial resources to commit to the investments that were required, government had to grapple with the funding options, which by 2012 was not forthcoming. And a new master plan was then commissioned by way of an update. And this was again prepared by an international consulting firm called Doha Consulting from South Korea, from funds from the African Development Bank. Again, 2012 to 2016, nothing could happen in terms of realizing the infrastructure investment needs because of lack of financial resources. With the new government, the project was also brought up with the line ministry, and government decided that the decision factors that led to the scoping of the investment needs in 2002 and 2012 must have changed, because it was realized that to do an investment in 2016, when the studies were done way back in 2022, needed an update. So then a new master plan was commissioned. And in 2018, this was prepared again by an international consulting firm called Royal Haskoning of the Netherlands. And in July 2019, government approved the recommendations of the master plan. Now, this master plan that was prepared in 2019 looked at the immediate capacity improvement needs of the Port of Banjul and came with essentially three basic recommendations. One was to increase the existing jetty by 200 meters to allow the port to increase the ship's accommodation facility, whereby 3 ocean-going vessels could be handled simultaneously as opposed to the current 2, and then to expand the container terminal within the half-dry area in an area previously occupied by residential property to create more room for handling of containers. And then thirdly, to invest in digitalization. Now, these were the 3 main components that were identified in this 2019 master plan. The master plan also came with a business plan, 2019 to 2023. And one of the main risks that was identified is that if the port does not commit to any infrastructure improvement on these 3 components that were identified, it stands the threat of losing cargo to neighboring ports. And this is the reality that we've been grappling with for the past few years. Now, this master plan also looked at the alternative location of the seaport away from Banjul to in one of the areas along the southern coastline in search of deeper water, because it is realized that Banjul has a physical constraint in terms of the access channel. There is a sandbar in the access channel coming to Banjul between buoys number 2 and 3 off the coast of Cape Point, which restricts the size of vessels that can call to Banjul. And this is at 9.5 meters. So this is the major constraint that Banjul faces as a port. Again, Banjul is also in an estuary, and there's frequent need for dredging because of the sedimentation. With the flow and ebb of the tide, a lot of material gets deposited along the shorelines, and this causes sedimentation and requires often dredging. Another risk that Banjul is faced with, our capacity to expand towards the city is constrained by the fact that the port is located within residential neighborhood and its close proximity to the commercial business district in Banjul. These are the major physical constraints that Banjul is faced with. And that's why the master plan also explored the potential to have a new deep sea port in the southern coastline of the country, where you will have deeper draft to attract bigger ships that are coming to West Africa, but could not come to Banjul because of this physical constraint. Now, as a rule of thumb in the industry, to get a facility in the southern coastline to have a deep water port will require minimum investment of $500 million to do the breakwater that is necessary to have a safe anchorage for the vessels and the ancillary support infrastructure. So the master plan deemed that the business case was not strong enough to commit to that investment. That's why it recommended immediate capacity improvement in Banjul over a 20-year horizon based on the demand forecast that was prepared for 2019 to 2038. And the envelope that was envisaged is about $131 million to realize this infrastructure improvement. Now, government had looked at the various funding options through the traditional development partners, because one may realize that the first three series of the port expansion projects were funded by the African Development Bank through concessionary loans that were given to the government of the Gambia and on lend to the port. And the World Bank had also, and the European Investment Bank, expressed commitment to finance some of these infrastructure improvement projects. But again, the time it took to go through all these rigors of the financing arrangements, negotiation, going through the compliance and integrity checklist, due diligence report, was taking time, and the business in the port was still suffering. That's why government deemed it fit to invoke the PPP option. Now, the decisions to invoke a private partner in the ownership and management of the Port of Banjul is considered along the lines that the maritime ecosystem is changing gradually. And one would realize that within the West and Central African region in which the Port of Banjul is located, practically all the ports in the sub-region, except for Banjul and maybe Guinea-Bissau, remain under public ownership and management. Virtually all the ports, beginning from Nouadhibou in Mauritania, coming way down all the way to Lobito in Angola, all the ports are dotted with injection of private capital in terms of the ownership and management, where you have the likes of DP World, the likes of APM Terminal, the likes of Bolloré, and other international port operators. Now, the advantage that private participation in the ownership and management of port brings to the table is that it can leverage on the easy access to financial resources that is disposed with the private partner. They come along also with their management expertise, and also they can direct where the cargo goes. So at times, to remain relevant, Banjul Port is obliged to up its game and also look for private strategic partners that would ensure that the competitiveness of the Port of Banjul is enhanced and sustained. These are primarily the reasons why the government of the Gambia and the GPA deemed it fit to leverage on this potential that the private sector has to inject the necessary financial resources to do the capacity improvements in Banjul and also improve trade and logistics in the country. The way this PPP arrangement has been structured is such that government through the GPA would both be a landlord in terms of being the grantor of the facility and a shareholder in this SPV that is created with this investor. The advantage also this has in terms of the arrangement is that project financing generally is evolving. It's a very dynamic field, and people are looking at very innovative ways of ensuring that assets that are strategic to the country remain in some form under public ownership that benefit the government and the people of that country. These are one of the reasons why this PPP arrangement is structured such that the GPA is a landlord and a shareholder in the special purpose vehicles. And the highlights of some of the key advantages and also risks involved in venturing into this private partnership will be elaborated in a presentation that I would maybe humbly crave your indulgence to be patient with us. We run you through the presentation that we have for you today, so that at the end of the day, as I said earlier, being an important arm of government as the fourth estate, your role in disseminating the information that is relevant and required for the population will be very important to the success of this important foreign direct investment, which is by far the biggest ever in the history of this country. I'll stop there for now, and thank you for your attention, and wish to congratulate you also for honoring our invitation. Your presence here and the presence of the various, and I could say virtually all the important media outlets in this country, shows how important you hold this project and the significance it has for the continued socio-economic development of our beloved country.
Is to thank the management of the Gambia Ports Authority for realizing and acknowledging the need to explain these important agreements their office have made with this Turkish company for the transformation of the Gambia Ports Authority. The fact that the ports management has recognized that there is a need for every detail about this to be transparently relayed to the public shows their willingness and their commitment to transparency, for which we will commend Mr. Jabata and his staff, because transparency, like you would know, these days is an expensive commodity, a rare commodity, if you like, in many areas, not just the Gambia, but all over the world. People want to know what has been agreed or signed on their behalf. So if we have the ports management realizing and acknowledging that it's important they explain, then that's commendable. And that does not mean, of course, or my sitting here does not mean that we will have any mercy in our probe or in our line of questioning into whatever areas that we may have had the public express concern about. And I'm sure the fact that the Ports Authority management have the courage to bring us here, obviously I know no stone will be left unturned in their explanation and transparently as is about the nitty-gritties of the project. So far, I almost had a feeling that the managing director had started the deliberation in earnest in his speech, because the speech was so informative that I almost thought he had started the presentation in earnest. And some of the raison d'etat that he outlined are very convincing and compelling, especially the need, for example, to make the Gambia Ports Authority competitive and to take care of all the hindrances that are there that made us to be, a second fiddle, if you like, compared to the competitive edge that other ports enjoy across the region. I think the reason that is really compelling, and we can say definitely it is a move that really is worthy of taking. And since he had said the risks, that people are concerned about, a lot of care has been taken to ensure that all the areas that might be risky have been taken care of. So the country stands to gain far more than in fact, it can meet the eye at this moment. So we can hope and pray that this project will be implemented to the success that we all desire, so that our own Gambia Ports Authority will be as competitive as those ports in other areas. And we all pray for your success, the Honorable Managing Director. So at this stage, I will really thank you very much once again for having the courage to come to the media and the willingness to explain to the public. I commend you and your management for that. And I urge our colleagues to feel free and ask questions that you had the public expressing interest for the benefit of the country. Thank you very much.
So with the yellow containers is what we call Old Banjul Wharf. This was the jetty that was established when the port was created in 1972. It's 103 meters in length, and it has two accommodation points. We call them berths. Berth number 1 is the one on the outer face, and berth number 2 is the one on the inner face. What is peculiar about this picture is also that you will see the berth, the Old Banjul Wharf, is closer to the shore than the other berth, which is on the left side. Because it is closer to the shore, it has a draft restriction or depth. At the outer face, with the dredging, we have up to 9 meters. And in the inner face, because it is closer to the shoreline, it is virtually silted up, and the draft there in terms of depth is about 6 meters. So what happens is we cannot accommodate commercial ocean-going vessels in this inner berth because of, 1, the length, and 2, the draft is very shallow. So that's why normally what we refer to as the port having berth accommodation is only 3. The outer face of berth number 1. And then on the left side of the picture, you have the new Banjul Wharf, we call it. It's 300 meters in length. And there also, in as much as it is much further in the water, US dollars, and another 6.8 million, all grant from the transition support facility window. Now, the project also came with another grant of 450,000 US dollars. And this came from the Africa Adaptation and Acceleration Program, AAAP, which is a joint initiative of the ADB and the Global Center for Adaptation. And this was to give technical assistance so that we can mainstream climate resilience into the port expansion. Now, AAAP, they use cutting-edge climate analytics to identify and quantify the impact of the physical climate risk on the port infrastructure, and also recommended adaptation measures to climate-proof the project. Now, this is a very interesting topic in the sense that the AAAP funds, the $450,000, were utilized and an international tender was launched, and a consulting firm won the contract to now do the climate risk and vulnerability stress test for Banjul Port, because they determined that because of the climate risk that Banjul is exposed to, before you start any investment, you must do a climate risk assessment. So now they partnered with Royal Haskoning and Cityscape, which is a local company. And they did the climate risk assessment for Banjul. And what the results of this 68-page report did was to identify the main risks that Banjul is exposed to. And principally, it is 1, the threat of sea level rise by up to 1 meter around the year 2040. And then there's increased sedimentation, as I explained, because the port is in an estuary. There's usually sand gets deposited along the shoreline, and it reduces the depth in the water. And then the third was the increased precipitation, because nowadays the climate in the world is changing, so there's hotter regions are becoming even hotter. So now the study also identified this risk, but also recommended mitigation measures. For the physical infrastructure, it recommended that there should be 15% cost overrun to ensure that the infrastructure is climate resilient. So what that means is for any project estimate, you have to add 15% on top of it so that the structures will be resilient to the risks of the climate as a mitigating measure. Because of our innovativeness in this approach, warranted Banjul Port to be identified by Climate Champions of Africa. And in fact, last month we were invited to do a presentation as a pilot project to show how Banjul Port is one of the few ports in the whole of Africa to have adopted a climate resilience approach in our project implementation. And this was as a result of this preparatory activity that we did from this facility that we received from the African Development Bank. Okay, the ADB grant components also had 5 components. That $20 million was supposed to be spent, or is supposed to be spent on these 5 components. 1 is the climate resilient completion and widening of the 3-kilometer bond road access to the port of Banjul. Because going to the port of Banjul, there's an artery that branches off from the main highway into Banjul, and that is the bond road, we call it, that leads directly to the port. So they believe that it is something that needs to be upgraded and widened. The widening is to do 1.5 meter on either side of the road to create a hard shoulder so that the road will be more accessible because it's very narrow. Now, the project is looking at that so that it can facilitate movement in and out of the port. Then the second item was the procurement of a new ferry for the Banjul Bara crossing point because of the limited capacity in terms of the fleet availability along this route. So the project, $13.2 million of that $20 million amount is targeted for the new green ferry. Then the third was the trade facilitation measure at the port of Banjul, which is done through a diagnosis study also that was done in partnership with the TBI, the Tony Blair Institute. And there's a trade diagnostic study that has produced a report to show how to improve efficiency in the logistics chain in the port of Banjul. Fourth is the acquisition of a consultant to prepare an integrated climate-smart transport master plan. This is for the Ministry of Transport to see how we can come up with an integrated transport master plan that will look at all modes of transport in the country. And then fifth was to provide technical assistance to the Ministry of Transport for capacity development. So these are the 5 components that those grant funds from ADB are targeted, and some of them are currently being implemented, been in various stages. For example, the widening of the Bond Road, there was a study that was done by NRA, and the bidding was done, and I think they now need to just update the BOQ that was prepared then, so that we can go to the market and solicit for the contractor to do the road widening. The ferry is in progress because the African Development Bank has released 20% advance payment, so the contract is effective, and we expect delivery by the end of 2025, because it's supposed to be 16 months from date of effectiveness. And the trade facilitation measure, I've already dwelt on that. We are also doing in collaboration with partners in government and the TBI, which is the Tony Blair Institute, and the acquisition of the consultant for the preparation of the integrated master plan. That has been handled by the ministry. I think I can authoritatively state that tenders have been launched through the media, and consultancy firms are expressing interest with a view to appointing a consultant to prepare this master plan. And technical assistance to the ministry is also ongoing. In terms of impact, the port, if it is upgraded, it will reduce ship turnaround time. So ADB thought that doing the preparatory activities will also add value to the main infrastructure that you are going to do to expand the capacity in the port. It will enable reduction in ship freight cost charges and demurrage payment. And the works will boost the facility's capacity to meet the growing traffic and improve efficiency in operations and management as it digitalizes its procedures. The introduction of the green and low carbon emission ferries will make the port infrastructure more climate friendly and climate resilient. And the project is also expected to empower women's group through gender sensitive procurement and provide jobs, especially for the youth. Now, just a rundown of the activities that had happened with the green ferry since we received the approval of the bank, because the bank funding is such that in terms of procurement, at every stage, you have to solicit the no objection from the African Development Bank before you can proceed in the procurement steps. So that has led to them granting approval in March this year. And then the contract was signed with Damen Shipyard of the Netherlands on 16th of April. And delivery is expected by end of December 2025, as I said, which is minimum 16 months from date of effectiveness, when 20% advance from IDB was received by Damen in July this year. And the Ministry of Transport had also informed GPA management of government decision to finance a second ferry for the Banjul Bara crossing point. So the GPA in this project, there's going to be 2 ferries. One is being financed by the African Development Bank, and the second is being procured by GPA from its own resources. Now, with us, we're doing the financing arrangements with the local bank, and we expect that by the turn of the year, the contract would have been effective, and also the delivery would be 16 months from date of effectiveness, meaning when the advance payment is received by the shipbuilder. Now, to the Port of Banjul concession. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, that there were delays in arriving at financial close from the numerous funding options that government was pursuing through corporate loan or concessionary funding from the African Development Bank, the European Investment Bank. So the GPA Board of Directors decided in a meeting on the 17th of November 2021 to grant approval for the PPP option to be explored, on the notion that it is expected that it will achieve quicker results to realize our project needs. This is also against the background that private sector has proven to be quicker in the implementation of port capacity improvement, and government could leverage on this potential to commit the private partner to an investment schedule, but based on set timelines. Further to that, GPA was informed by the ministry about government decision to proceed with the PPP option for the Port of Banjul. That was in February 2022. Now, just a background about private sector participation in the ownership and management of ports. This is quite prevalent in West Africa. As you can see, the examples we quote here, Ghana had this arrangement since 2002, where the Ghana Ports and Harbors Authority owns 30% of the concession, and a consortium of APMT, which is AP Mola Terminals, which is a big global shipping operator, and Bolloré own 70% of the equity. In Sierra Leone, previously, Bolloré had 100% of the concession, but recently the government of Sierra Leone decided to renegotiate the concession contract and arrive at an agreement with the concession partner, Bolloré, where government will now take 20% equity. But then the concession partner, because they had 100% concession for 25 years, they also renegotiated with the government to increase the duration of the concession agreement to 35 years. Because they said now, since you want to take shares in the business, then we will extend the period to 35 years. So that was what was peculiar in the Sierra Leone model. And now recently, you see what is happening with our neighboring port. They have the arrangement where DP World has 60% of the equity, and the Port Autonome de Dakar has 40% in this new port and Diane. What is also peculiar about this 60-40 arrangement is that government has 40% stake in the infrastructure in this new port and Diane. And the arrangements with the investor, DP World, is such that the investor would commit to do the basic infrastructure works that is required in the whole of the area. And the portion that government owns will be constructed, but then the government will not be required to make any financial contribution to develop its own part. The investor will do that, and then they will deduct it from future payments that are due to the government from the investor in terms of royalty payments and dividend. So they are getting their area developed by the concessionaire partner without having to put in any financial resources. And this concession also, this Port and Diane is just an extension of an existing concession. Because in 2008, the DP World, which is Dubai Port World, had this concession agreement with Port of Dakar that had some expansion triggers. The expansion triggers were based on volume. In that agreement, if volumes were to reach 700,000 containers in a particular year, that would flag the need for further expansion of the port facility. So now by 2012, they had achieved that volume because of the increased capacity. So government was negotiating with the port, the concession partner, to expand the port. But the owners realized that Dakar is already congested. So why not build a new port in Diane, which is about 40 kilometers of Dakar? That's how this new project came about. But it's an extension of an existing contract, and it's also for another 30 years. If you look at the landscape, as I said earlier, we are the only port under public ownership and management in the whole of West Africa, except maybe for Guinea-Bissau. But Bissau is peculiar in the sense that they have physical constraint. Most of these ocean-going vessels cannot call at their port because of the draft restriction. So Port of Banjul, at some point, to remain relevant, we have to up our game and be amongst these big players. Because, as I said earlier, the capacity to access financial resources that are required for this huge investment repose more with the private sector than government. And what it does also, they bring along management expertise. Because the likes of DP World, the Bolloré, the APMT, they have cutting-edge technology when it comes to managing port facilities, because they are the big players. And the trade networks also in international trade, they control the ships and they direct where cargo goes. They can have cargo for Banjul, but because they have a faster service elsewhere, they can direct that same cargo to go to that port and then go by land and to your country. Because for them, the turnover is what matters in business. Because the faster the turnover, the more revenue they have. Again, to be more precise, the Port of Banjul concession was launched through an international competitive bidding in August 2022, based on a business case that was prepared by a consultant that was hired to do the business model for Banjul. And this consultant is called Maritime Transport and Business Solutions of the Netherlands. Before going to the market to attract a private investor, you first need to develop a business case. That is to develop a model based on what are the investment scope, the infrastructure needed, and what you require to do the investment. So that document is what you now take to go to the market and do a tender and invite bidders who are interested to bid on specific requirements that you put in a business model. So that's why the business model was developed. And Maritime Transport Business Solutions of the Netherlands, MTBS we call them, were hired as a consultant as a result of an international competitive bidding we launched for this consultancy. Now, by the end of the bid submission, 9 international port operators and 1 local company had expressed interest to participate in the concession process. Following the short list of these EOIs, because when we received the 10 EOIs, we did a short list to look at the companies that have the financial resources and what it requires to participate in this process. So out of that short list of 10, we came up with 8 firms that were selected, and then they were now invited to go to the next stage in the tender process, which is to submit detailed technical and financial submission. After that was done, the evaluation of the financial and technical submissions were received. It resulted in 3 responsive bidders being selected out of the 8. And these were Red Sea Gateways Terminals of Saudi Arabia. You had Yilport of Turkey and Al Barak of Turkey, which were recommended for award of this concession. Now, in considering the recommendations of the evaluation report that was submitted by the PPP Technical Working Group, which did the whole bidding process and the evaluation, of course, assisted by the transaction advisory firm, MTBS. Cabinet reviewed the 3 criteria that were put in the evaluation according to the request for proposal, which is the RFP document that was launched in the tender. Now, the tender document, the RFP, had 3 criteria. 1 was to look at the technical submission from these interested parties. 2, to look at their financial submission. And also, there was a 3rd criteria called strategic commercial fit, where the interested party were given the opportunity to present an alternative proposal, which is different from the one that we identified in the business model as our case. So in tender, usually it is normal to have bidders to comply to your requirement, and also given the opportunity to also suggest alternatives that would add value to what you're looking for. So that was that criteria, strategic commercial fit. And it was in reviewing that cabinet realized that one of the bidders, they had mentioned a strategic commercial fit, and this was Al Barak. And what they mentioned in their strategic commercial fit as an alternative is say, look, government, you are having a lot of physical challenges in Banjul based on these studies that have identified the risks Banjul is prone to. Why not look for an alternative deep sea port? Because vessels calling to Banjul are restricted in size, in the depth, to 9.5 meters. Whereas if you look at the maritime landscape, vessels coming to West Africa from Europe and the Far East, they do what they call port to port. And they arrange these ports in a cluster. So you have a cluster that spans between Nouadhibou up to around Sierra Leone. Now those clusters are serviced by ships. They call West Africa Max vessels nowadays, and they do port to port call. Those vessels are 12 meters draft. But they cannot call Banjul because Banjul, more than 9.5 meters, you cannot call Banjul because of that problem in the channel. There's a big sandbar off the coast of Cape Point, which restrict the water depth to 9.5 meters. Now, again, what that also goes to mean is that the analogy I always like to give people is you have 2 road vehicles going to Basse, for example, a bus and a 7-seater. The bus will charge cheaper in terms of passenger fares than a 7-seater because they carry more passengers. So that's the same analogy with shipping. The vessels that come to West Africa and cannot call Banjul are bigger. They carry huge volume. So in terms of freight rate, they charge a cheaper rate per unit. Because Banjul is serviced by dedicated feeder service, we call them. All these big shipping lines, they have a special vessel that comes to Banjul because of that draft restriction. So what that does is we do not benefit from the economies of scale. Rather, we get disadvantaged by this economy because special vessels are coming to Banjul. That's why usually we hear this outcry that freight to Banjul is more expensive than Dakar. For one container is at times even up to more than 1,000 US dollars difference in freight. So that's what Al-Barak proposed, that they want to engage government to consider doing minimal investment in Banjul, but consider to do a new deep sea port. And Sanyang village was identified as the most optimal location amongst 7 locations that were explored, starting from, I think, around Banjul up to Tujereng. 7 locations were explored, and Sanyang was found to be the most ideal in terms of its proximity to the deep water and the land area that is available for the construction of the deep sea, the support infrastructure. Now, on this background, Al-Barak was also then invited to submit a commercial proposal for the investment that they needed to commit to improve Banjul maybe over a 6-year period, and then whilst they are doing the construction in Sanyang. Because doing the deep sea port in Sanyang would take some time. Whilst at Banjul, you currently have a situation because there's a demand you need to service. So the arrangement that the government requested Al-Barak to do is to now submit a commercial proposal which will look at immediate improvement in Banjul and the development of the deep sea port in Sanyang. Now, because it was an international tender, this same opportunity was extended to these 2 other bidders because they were also shortlisted as preferred bidders, just to give them the opportunity to also submit on the same terms that Al-Barak is now requested to do. So now, the Red Sea Gateway Terminal from Saudi Arabia accepted the offer, but with conditions. Their condition was that the Sanyang model is not bankable because you don't have the volume that would justify the type of investment that is required to do the deep sea port in Sanyang. So for them, their condition was, allow us to operate Banjul, then when the volume justifies the investment in Sanyang, we are committed to do it. The other bidder, Yilport, they declined. So then government now requested Al-Barak to submit, through its due diligence, a detailed proposal and show proof that they have the financial resources to commit to doing Banjul and then developing the deep sea port in Sanyang. And this they were required to do by November 2023, 24 November to be precise, so that government can now look at that proposal and decide on the next steps. In that same decision to go on the request for Al-Barak, the detailed proposal, government had also instructed through the ministry that we appoint a transaction advisory service firm to check the adequacy that Al-Barak is now going to submit and see whether we can talk to them and guide negotiations up to financial close. So this particular assignment was given to MTBS. Why? Because they were the consultants who prepared the Banjul business model in the first place. And if it were not for this Sanyang option, their service would have continued up to transaction advisory support, up to financial close. They would have assisted us until we signed the contract for Banjul. But because now the dynamics have changed in terms of the scoping of the project, to go to tender and award another consultancy, the time would not have allowed that. And also, they were already under contract. So we deemed it fit to do an extension of their contract for them to assist the GPA in this process. So they were appointed also in December for the services that I already elaborated. Now, by 21st December, this consultant, MTBS, they had submitted an initial assessment of the submission that Al-Barak made in November. And they recommended that before we go into contract with them, let us have what we call a pre-contract negotiation, and they call it heads of terms, that it is advisable to call this investor and you agree on some basic parameters before you go into the concession proper. So that's how this heads of term negotiation started, of course, with the involvement of the relevant stakeholders in government through the PPP Technical Committee, where you had the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Transport, Minister of Justice, Minister of Trade, GIPA, GPPA, and all the relevant government stakeholders, Minister of Lands, were all in this technical committee and assisted by this consultant, MTBS, to have this face-to-face heads of terms negotiation with the contractor. And when the negotiations ensued, that led to the signing of the concession agreement in July 11, to be precise, in 2024. Now, under this concession agreement, Al-Barak is required to commit minimal investment in Banjul over a 6-year period to upgrade the terminal infrastructure to do the rehabilitation of the existing pavements in the yard and the jetty area. Also to commit to relocating the present head office of the GPA, because those of you familiar with our office is right in the middle of the operational zone. And at times it impedes the smooth flow of traffic around the terminal. They will also do construction of what we call a pre-gate parking. It's to marshal all these trucks that are lined up coming to take delivery at the port. They will have an area where they will be dedicated, and they will only come into the port to pick cargo on a calling system. And they will also commit to procure additional cargo handling equipment and also implementation of the digitalization project. The equity sharing is what is agreed in this model, where there is no financial commitment from either government or GPA, and then a percentage share of the gross revenue, whilst they are in Banjul, will accrue to GPA. So what that means is the investor will commit to do the financial investment that is required to do all these components in Banjul, so that Banjul efficiency can be improved within 6 years, whilst they are constructing the Sanyang. So, but in that arrangement, even though government is not making any financial contribution, and our landed assets, they are not used by the investor as collateral to raise the financing needs for the project, but we will still get 4% of the gross revenue in Banjul whilst they are operating. That is what we negotiate with them. And then, apart from the gross revenue, what we deem to be the net profit income, the investor will not carry it away for their own commercial use. It will be put in an escrow account, like reserve fund, so that when the investment in Sanyang becomes due, government can tap on those profits to invest in Sanyang, just to test the commitment of the investor, that you want to build a new port in Sanyang, but you are operating Banjul. Now, while you're operating Banjul, do all this investment to upgrade the facility and improve efficiency, attract more cargo. You pay us percentage of the gross revenue, and then the profit you put in an account that will be reserved, so that when the construction in Sanyang starts, we take from that money to start the construction. And then all the financing risk will be borne by the investor. Government is not going to take any loan. There will be no contribution from GPA or government in terms of financing this project. They will do it entirely on their own. And then the concession in Sanyang will be for a 30-year period. After the 30 years, the asset will now be handed back to government. But in Banjul, after the 6 years, when they move to Sanyang, Banjul will remain with government. They only move to Sanyang, while Banjul will revert to government. So it's like an interim arrangement. And as I said earlier, 4% of the gross revenue will accrue to GP and the government, both in Banjul and in Sanyang. That's as a landlord. And then as a shareholder, we get 20% of the dividend. So that's the way this transaction was structured with Alberta. In terms of highlights, what we see for the Port of Banjul is, as I said earlier, government will hold 20% equity in this new special purpose vehicle. Because what happens is we're going to, it is already established. A company is established in which the investor holds 80% and the GPA holds 20%. And this is the company that is called Alport Banjul. Now, the investor will commit $19 million to do the investment that is needed in Banjul and run Banjul to improve the efficiency over the next 6 years. And the investment will include the scope that I said earlier, including equipment and the new container terminal and the parking area. Also, the vehicle calling system to be established at Bond Road. And then another feature in this Banjul arrangement is that all our movable assets, those trailers, the reach stackers, those handling equipment, and all the gear that we use for operation, we'll put a value on them. So it was $3 million by the time we were doing the negotiation, because it was based on the book value. But now, before the contract becomes effective in January 2025, we will do a valuation of the market value of all our assets that are movable, and the investor will pay for that, because they are coming to find a port that is already running. So they have to pay government through GPA for all the assets that they find on the ground, based on the market value. So that is also what we also negotiated with Alberta. So they will pay us for the assets and then continue using them. The GPA will receive the 4% gross revenue, as I mentioned earlier, and then the net profits will be put in an escrow account. So it's like whilst they're operating in Banjul, the profits, after they pay us the 4% on the gross revenue, the profits that derive from the business will not be used by the investor. They will be put in an escrow account. Escrow means it is jointly managed. So both us and them are managing that account. And the intention of government is for those funds, profits from Banjul, will be used later when the Sanyang investment becomes due. As I said earlier, then another non-negotiable instrument we had in this negotiation with Alberta was that all the operative staff that are involved in the operation will be transferred to the company under the same terms and conditions of employment to ensure that there's job security for our staff, meaning that the company is not coming in and sending people home. They are going to absorb all the staff that are involved in the operations. So that is one of the things that we call it a non-negotiable instrument in the contract agreement. And this was made known to them from the beginning. And they have consented to that. GPA, as a landlord, will get those benefits in terms of the gross revenue. But also as a shareholder, we have seats at the board and the management of the company. Why that is? Because the asset is strategic to the country. And there are certain decisions that need to be made. It has to have our express consent and our involvement. The lawyers are here. Maybe they would like to dilate on that more. In the concession agreement, there are certain clauses we call reserve matters, that where decisions need to be made. In as much as they are the majority shareholder, they do not have that mandate to take those decisions without our express consent. And these decisions revolve around investment, around HR issues, around financial reporting, compliance with environment, security issues, and KPIs, even the productivity levels that they are supposed to meet whilst they're operating the port. These are instruments that we call reserve matters in the agreement, whereby because of their majority shareholding, they do not have the overriding power to take decisions on those issues without our express involvement. This is with a view to ensuring that the strategic nature of the asset and the public interest is preserved. For Sanyang, it's the same rundown of the highlights, where government is not making any financial contribution. The investor will bear all the financing risk. And one thing we also agreed with Alberta, because in preparing the business model, they were required to bring their own commercial proposal. So, but in the negotiation, we achieved this decision that the traffic forecast they were using to make the business model, we agreed that the forecast they used was quite conservative, because we know if the infrastructure improves, the potential for added volume should be factored in the business model to make the NPV more positive. So that's how we agreed with them to use our own traffic forecast rather than their own traffic forecast. And that helped the business model. The draft in the access channel in Sanyang will be 12 meters, as I said earlier. What this means is bigger ships that could not come to Banjul before will now access the port of Banjul through Sanyang, increase our competitiveness, and enhance and improve infrastructure to the country. And this is one of the highlights of this Sanyang port agreement, that at the end of the day, they will build the infrastructure. We attract bigger ships, increase our competitiveness, improve efficiency, get revenue, and then at the end of the day, get handed back and improve infrastructure, because government will own the infrastructure at the end of the concession period, so that the generations to come will enjoy those benefits, because the infrastructure would have been there. And one thing that is also key to note in this concession is that they don't have exclusivity over the whole 30-year period. Why that is? Because government is anticipating that in the event like a new business opportunity arises in the future, and you are locked in a concession that for 30 years, you will not have that latitude to invite new investors to take advantage of that opportunity. An example could be maybe oil exploration or a natural resource might appear somewhere around that area. But because they are the concession partner over the 30 years, if they maintain exclusivity over the whole period, it limits our capacity to talk to new investors to harness that opportunity. So that's why the investment, between 5 to 7 years, 7 to 5 years before the expiry of the concession, there's going to be the handback and taking over procedure, where we start now the process of them exiting and the asset being back to government, because there's a lot of requirements that need to be fulfilled. At the end of the day, because of the investment plan, the maintenance plan, the operational plan, you would not want to go into an agreement where you will get handed back an asset that will be dysfunctional after utilizing it, making their profit, and then leave you with an asset that is in a state of repair. That is not what is desired. So that's why there's that agreement, that arrangement clause in the agreement that a handback and taking over protocol has to be agreed with the investor, and that was done in the contract. The Sanyang arrangement, as I said earlier, is the same as in Banjul in terms of the equity, the dividend sharing, and also in the scope of the agreement, there is a agreement to build inland logistics platform in Kawur and in Basse to enhance our competitiveness, because we have realized that most goods that come to Banjul find their way to third countries by way of transit, cross-border, and re-export trade. So harnessing the river transport would bring more benefit in terms of cost efficiency, because studies have proven that to transport high volume, low value cargo like rice, sugar, flour, and most of the cargo that goes for the transit trade, they are cheaper in terms of cost per ton mile by river than by road. And the advantage river transport has is it removes a lot of vehicles on the road, reducing carbon emission, reducing accident on the road, and also the river potential for tourism attraction remains underexploited. So this project has all those features in terms of the river project that we intend to do with the investor. Local companies will be involved in the separate SPV that is set up in this inland transport, because the river transport is strategic to the country. So we've agreed with the investor that when it comes to investment in Kawur and in Basse, it has to be a separate JV where local participation will be encouraged. So it's going to be like a JV within a JV, because the river transport is very vital to our country. Now, local content is provided for in the arrangement, where 1% of the investment value by the investor will be paid to government. So government can tap on those forces for local content. Banjul shipyard is also part of the scope. The investor is required to upgrade, because as a port, we are the primary beneficiaries of a functional shipyard, because we operate marine craft, and the ferries are here, and a lot of industrial fishing vessels. Legal due diligence was also done, and this was by way of a consultancy that was done by Mayor Brown Associates. This is a company that has also assisted government in some arbitration cases. What has happened is African Development Bank also gave the grant funding and African Legal Support Facility were the ones handling the project, and they appointed the UK firm called Mayor Brown Associates to do the 3 work streams. 1 was the legal due diligence, 2 was to develop the business model, and 3, the transaction advisory support. So this was done in 2016, before we even started the PPP option. So by the time the first work stream, which was the legal due diligence, was done, they recommended to government that there's enough legal instrument that warrants the port to go into this PPP transaction, citing the Ports Act 1972, the GPPA Act as revised in 2024, and the PPP operational policies and guidelines. This is in a pictorial form what the investor will be required to do in Banjul, except for the Banjul Mini Stadium, which is outside of the project scope, because we don't want to start picking a fight with the mayor. On the left of the Banjul Mini Stadium is where you had the former GTTI VTC annex and the Muslim Senior Secondary School. Those areas have been acquired because the owners of the property approached the port for a sale, and those areas, they have now been demolished. So what we intend to construct there is to relocate the GPA head office there and do some off-dock terminals. The area within the yellow area marked yellow is where is the project scope. So the investor is required to upgrade the terminal and do a proper layout with the proper equipment so that it will increase efficiency and boost the capacity of the port environment. And this is only for a period of 6 years. When they move to Sanyang, this whole asset comes back to the GPA. Part of the project where we mentioned the pre-gate parking area is those familiar with the road to Banjul. There's a jar oil station just where you had former radio seat. It is at the intersection of Bond Road and the Banjul Highway, where the truck drivers union have a marshalling point for this heavy goods vehicle. Bordering that area, we have been allocated 150 meter by 100 meter. And this is the area we intend to construct the truck marshalling area, so that we move all the trucks out of the port area to ease traffic flow. There are plans even to engage the city council to have trucks that are within the Banjul business district that come to collect wares, to take them to other places, to also queue at this place. And they come into those places only on calling system to reduce congestion around the central business district in Banjul. So that's the area in Google Map as it looks. Yeah, that's the 150 by 100. And the Basse, and we excuse us for the poor quality of the picture image because we are trying to get the scope from the document, but it was difficult. But this is just a Google map to show the area in Kaur on the top, where the smaller portion in green is the existing area we have. And the Kaur jetty looks apparently in good structural integrity. And the area in green further to the right is occupied by former GGC. So, but we are talking to them and they are willing to cede the area to the project, but not to sell the land, but to hold equity in the project. So it was interesting that we put in an investment space for third party in the Kaur and Basse dry ports, as I mentioned in the previous slide. So you see now GGC, when we approach them, they're saying that no, they will not sell the land to us. Rather, they will transpose the land, do evaluation, and then that will form their equity in that project. So that is for Kaur and Basse, which is the picture below. And the most project-ready site is the one in the middle, which is the GGC site. The one on the right, I believe is what we call Basse, is it Dalaba? Yeah, Basse Dalaba. But it's owned by some private occupant. And we're in negotiations with them for its acquisition, for future development. And this is on the north bank of Basse, because the south bank is prone to flooding, especially during the summer, the rainy season. So, but this is apparently on a higher ground. And the ground there, because there's an old underutilized warehouse, the pavement is quite amenable to withstanding the load bearing of equipment that will be used in this facility. And then also its proximity with the bridge allows for easy connectivity. So these are the components that we include for the development, with all the other advantages that river revitalization has for this country. Yeah, that looks like Basse. This is our engagement with our consultants when we went on a scoping mission. In Sanyang, what is happening is there are two areas that we are looking at on the beach, and it's where you have this fish meal factory. So this is one of the areas that we did through our scoping mission, and it's just a Google map, and this is another layout of what we envisage to have in Sanyang. But right now, what is happening is we have appointed a consultant to do the assessment, the ESIA, to look at how we are going to acquire the land in Sanyang. How we are going to compensate occupants and then acquire the land. So, and it is done by evaluation assessment and also an environmental social impact assessment, because these projects, because it's supported by development partners, they want to know even the migratory bird species, how they are affected by the project, all the environmental concerns, how the risks are to be mitigated, if there's any need for restoration, how that can be handled by the project. So that is ongoing. But this is the area that we intend, when the investor comes, to do the proper studies, the geotechnical investigation, the detailed design for the structures to be built in Sanyang. And from their project scope, this is how they intend to have the facility from an artist's impression point of view. But this is subject to further studies, because after compensating the occupants and acquiring the land, the investor is committed to do a detailed engineering design, which is going to inform the type of structures that are going to be built in Sanyang. That's what we have for presentation. But oftentimes, you see a public outcry, why cede your asset and take minimal shares? But because the investor is bearing all the financing risk, we are not doing any financial contribution. And at the end of the day, we get handed over an asset. And in between, trade and competitiveness increases and the cost of doing business goes down. So it improves the livelihood of citizens. And another risk that is also being out in the public space is, what if they fail to perform? And in this concession agreement, the investor is required to fulfill certain requirements. That's why when the contract was signed in July, it does not become effective until January 2025. This 6 months period is what we call conditions precedent period, in which the investor is required to fulfill certain requirements and obligations to warrant government to allow them to go to the next step. Even on the 11th of July, a day prior to signing the agreement, there was a bond that the investor needed to carry. It's called a performance bond. And these are bonds that are encashable, in banks. So that's how government can mitigate some of the risks that are associated with non-investment or non-performance by the investor. And these bonds, they are series of bonds, from investment bonds to financial reporting to payments to KPIs. All the risks that are identified in non-performance have been identified and they are quantified, and then bonds are carried out by the investor. So for each stage, before we give approval to move on to another aspect of the project, these bonds have to be fulfilled. So I thank you for your attention.
It will bring about the acquisition of new ferries also under these projects. Because other benefits that actually somebody looking on the surface may not immediately notice, but going through the presentation, one tend to realize that we've got very good benefits in the contract. That's commendable. I want to ask, I came across I would formally call it a petition, but I put going under the banner or a brand called Half Die Must Not Die. What they are determining is that they need acquisition of properties or whatever nature, whether they have been bought from the owners or they have been forced to sell them or whatever way the residents around the country acquire, they believe that's good.
Thank you, Mr. Chan, for that pertinent question. What I can say authoritatively is that the decision to expropriate that parcel of land which is close to the port was a decision made by government in 1993 when they looked at the situation of the port, and our only natural expansion was towards the city. So this is the contiguous zone, which is a block of properties. At the time, they were identified to be about 58 plots between Hagan Street going towards the whole Marine Department, we call it Dockyard, along Brown Street, along Wellington Street and Cotton Street, that block of compounds. So this decision was made in 1993 by government to expropriate that land, and it will form part of the port expansion. As I said earlier, the first phase was acquired in 1994-95 when the former school of the late Dr. Ndao was acquired and some two other plots, just to build a link road between the jetty areas and the former PWD terminal. 2016, the first phase of the half-die was acquired, and in 2022, the second phase is already acquired. But the arrangement were on a willing seller, willing buyer arrangement. The property owners, because of the peculiar nature of Banjul in terms of land ownership, people in Banjul, they own the land in perpetuity, meaning it's not on the lease from government. It's what we call freehold. Freehold, what it means is the people own the land in perpetuity. So when they get compensated both for the land and the structures that are on them. So the way the acquisition process went was for the owners to have the opportunity to do their own valuation, and the GPA does its own independent valuation, and then we sit around a table for the negotiation on the value to be compensated, both for the land and the structures on them. And I can tell you that it has been successfully achieved. Part of the negotiation package included to allocate each property owner an alternative plot of land in Bakau Kachikali. This was with a view to ensuring that the families that are desirous of constructing a residential facility to ensure that the family heritage is maintained, they would have been given that opportunity. So that was the whole idea of allocating an alternative plot of land in Kachikali. Now, this is the only area that has been identified by government for expropriation. So the further development of the port towards the city, it is not envisioned, especially with this new arrangement. So that's where the acquisition would stop. Other properties that the GPA has acquired in half-die were willingly led to the authority by the owners. That is the Banjul Muslim Association. which are the owners of the former Muslim Senior Secondary School, and the GTTI Vocational Training Center, Banjul Annex, we used to call it Technical School, was also sold to the port by the owners, which is government. Because what has happened with those two facilities is that the enrollment figures had gone down and the facilities were virtually underutilized, particularly for Muslim Senior Secondary School, where they had enrollment figures of about more than 2,500 at some point, to an extent that they had less than 400 students attending the school. And the structure itself was not bearing its integrity in terms of the nature of the building that was there. So they were actually compensated through a negotiation. There are other schools also that are in the pipeline for acquisition, but the view is with a view to transforming them. So we are aware about the engagement, but I myself happen to have been born in Havdai, so I'm also part of the people that are known to be having some sort of information about what is going on. So these are people that are quite known and familiar to us, and some of the concerns that they have, anytime they engage the authority, we try to provide the explanation. So the acquisition of or relocation of Havdai residents is limited to only that zone. This is the contiguous zone within Havdai. What I can say also in addition is that when we were doing the validation of this new port master plan in January 2019, it coincided with the African Development Bank fielding a mission in country to witness the commissioning of the new Senegambia bridge. Because they were the traditional partners who financed the 3 series of the port expansion project, they participated in that validation workshop at the Atlantic Hotel. Now, during that workshop, the 2019 master plan was presented, and some of the ADB officials expressed keen interest in developing what came to be known as the integrated port city development. Their idea was that whilst the port is expanding, it should not affect the city in a negative way. Because you realize that most of the environmental concerns and the issues we have with the city council, particularly with waste management, noise pollution, and traffic congestion, is as a result of the activity around the ferries and the port of Banjul. So there and then we developed a pilot project concept note. And this was signed jointly by the managing director of the port, myself, the mayor of Banjul City Council, Rohi Malik Lo, the chairman of KMC, Mr. Talil Bensouda, and the then chairman of West Coast Region, Mr. Song. So we signed a joint request, and when it was sent to African Development Bank, within 3 months, they released a grant funding of 3 million euros to government to develop this integrated port city master plan. And one of the results I can say that came out of that funding was there was a mapping exercise that was done, and this zoning and mapping of properties came as a result of that project. So we have a very elaborate, and it's a pilot project for the African Development Bank. So they want to use this model to replicate in interventions in other ports in other countries. Under the concession agreement also, if the activity moves to Sanyang, 75% of the 23 hectare that is within the project scope, because the whole scope will revert to GPA, 75% of that area will now be turned into a property development, a real estate, the construction of a cruise and marina and fishing activity. That will remain under GPA. So we have plans under this concession that when the concession partner moves the activity to Sanyang, the area that is vacated, 75% of that will now be transformed into a property and estate development project under a JV arrangement, separate with the concessionaire. So what that envisages is to now have Banjul be a place for resident and recreation. Havdai would be restored in a way, but with a new facility, and it will be upgraded in a sense. But that estate redevelopment is mentioned in the concession agreement, but it is subject to a separate business proposal that will be structured along the lines of a JV. Because government is mindful that the property would remain with government, and then the future use and the alternative use that has to be the discretion of government and not the investor. So this is just to assuage the fears of.
They will consider all Pabda residents who want to acquire at certain time.
Well, yes, if the property development comes, it depends on what government negotiates, but it would be natural justice to have the previous property owners also involved in deriving whatever economic benefit that this new estate development project is to be realized. But we have taken note of your concern, and that's why this communication strategy or program is very important, because we get feedback. And this is just the beginning of a series of engagements that we intend to have with the general public. Because this project is of a national character. And all views are important. All concerns will be taken on board. And this communication outreach program that we are doing is well documented. It just happens to coincide that the media is coming today. And tomorrow we're going to Sanyang village. And that will be the last of the 4th series of engagement. We will fan back. Yes, prepare our report and then have a feedback mechanism. Okay.
The air is filled, with rumors or expectations of compensation. Government is going to compensation all of Sanyang or the land that the air is filled with that expectation. And people often don't know, they have no clarity about it. I want to take this to ask you, who are going to be compensated? Is it the Sanyang village as a whole, or owners or capital who owns land in that area?
Well, as I showed in the earlier slide, the artist's impression that we have so far about the facility that is to be constructed in Sanyang, there are 2 components in the land that government intends to acquire in Sanyang. The area that is earmarked for the construction of the port facility, and then the rest of the area from the beachfront to the highway. And I know with certainty that government has plans to construct 2 roads that are leading from the highway to the beachfront. So the port facility will be sandwiched in between these 2 roads for greater accessibility. The compensation and acquisition for the occupants within the scope that is envisaged for the construction of the port facility is one aspect. But then the other aspect is the rest of the area that government intends to acquire. So the thinking is that some of the restrictions that we are faced with in Banjul, there should be adequate provision of enough backup land for future development, because the business is anticipated to grow and you don't want to be caught up and straddled with the need to acquire more land. So government is now approaching the land compensation and acquisition in 2 phases or in 2 lots. The immediate, which is what is required for the port, and then the second phase, what will be reserved for future use. So now the way we are going about it is, first and foremost, we have appointed a consultant to do an assessment of the area, not only the occupants, but the whole environmental issues, the risks and mitigating strategies. Even if there need for restoration, this study will identify that, and funds will be provided to make sure that the livelihood and the habitat and the people in Sanyang village itself, they will be impacted positively by this project. On the side of the investor, what the concession agreement also envisages under the CSR policy, to have a lot of intervention that would benefit the community of Sanyang. And by and large, if ancillary support infrastructure is constructed to support the port business in terms of the special economic zones, the free economic zones, these are opportunities for local content provision for businesses to grow, socio-economic activity that surrounds the business, job opportunities. And the mere fact that it is located in Sanyang will be a center of attraction for a lot of economic activity. So these are the wider benefits. But we don't want to preclude what the community is going to come up with. But I am confident in making this statement that the project will impact the communities in a positive way.
Are there any risks involved in this concession agreement? If yes, what are they?
The primary risk is the physical constraint we have as a port in Banjul. If no investment is done immediately, we stand the threat of losing business to neighboring ports, which is actually a reality. Because what the congestion does, it diverts cargo away from your port. in terms of the concession proper, some of the risks have already been identified in terms of non-performance. And the situation where the investor will commit and then not fulfill its commitment is one of the major risks that we have identified. And the way the mitigating strategies have been agreed in the concession agreement is to commit the investor to some bonds. Like a day before the concession agreement proper was signed, the concessionaire was obliged to submit a performance bond, and these are encashable through banks. Now, from the performance bond, there's bonds for Banjul and bonds for Sanyang, both for pre-construction, for operations, for financial reporting, for meeting certain KPIs, for investment and maintenance, and for handback of the facility. So those are the major risks involved in this concession agreement, where the concession partner would sign up to an agreement but then not deliver. So the way we mitigate that risk is to have them commit to bonds that you can encash. And because it is a competitive bid, we're alive to the opportunity that also exists with the other investors that are already in the process. So that's the way we hedge the risk. And if government were in a position to determine that the concession agreement were to be terminated for whatever reason, as provided for there's a whole chapter on termination and compensation. So adequate compensation would be made to the defaulting party. So those are risks that are also in the concession agreement, and there are some strategies to mitigate them. But by and large, the major risk is on non-performance or non-delivery of the commitment of the concession partner. And that has been mitigated by these bonds that I've tried to explain that they are obliged to carry. And one of them was already fulfilled before we signed. And during this conditions precedent period, which is the 6 months before the contract becomes effective, other bonds will be invoked, dealing with the investment plan, the Sanyang pre-construction investigation, submission of detailed engineering drawing, procurement contracts. All of those are bonds that we carry in the concession agreement. And as a grantor of the facility, we have that obligation to monitor the contract because we're both a landlord and a shareholder in the business. So there are certain decisions also that the investor cannot take without our express consent. That is in the management of the facility. And lawyers are here, maybe they may like to elaborate more on that, but these are what we refer to as reserve matters in the concession agreement, where the investor cannot unilaterally, because of the majority shareholding, take certain decisions when it comes to investment, certain decisions when it comes to HR, when it comes to financial reporting, without the express consent of the government, which is the minority holder in this case. So that's the way we have been able to agree on mitigating these risks that were major, and they were identified in the concession contract.
The turnaround time at the courts, given the current situation, and the additional freight charges incurred by businesses bringing goods into the country, and how that also affects the cost of living in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Choi, for that important question. The average turnaround time of ships currently is 14 days. It has increased this year compared to last year, when we had some efficiency improvement measures implemented and there were gains that were realized. Prior to that, they were on average 21 days, but it came down to less than 14 and even up to less than 5 days. Earlier, late in 2023, we were having ships call and go straight to Bali because of some operational efficiency measures that we put in place. But what is peculiar in these last 6 months is that the dynamics have changed in international shipping, where most of the bulk cargo that were coming in containers are now going back to what we call tramp shipping, where cargo is handled in its loose form in terms of bags on bulk cargo vessels. So these bulk cargo vessels, because they are coming at a time when this time of the year, we're in the rainy season, there's low productivity because when it rains, there's no cargo work, particularly on these bulk cargo vessels. So that is now exacerbating the waiting time of these vessels. That's the primary cause. And because we have only 3 slots to accommodate ships, oftentimes the productivity is low during this period. But we are hopeful that once we get into the drier period, the efficiency will improve and the ship's waiting time will reduce, because that's one of the main determinants of port performance. So ships want to know when they come to your port, up to the time they leave, how much time they spend. Because in shipping, freight is earned while you're moving. If you're stationary, it's all costs. And all those costs, they go to add on to the freight charges. Typically, when ship owners are faced with congestion, they levy what is called a congestion surcharge, which is a demurrage on each container that comes to Banjul. What we know with certainty is that late 2022, there was a congestion surcharge of $200 for each 20-foot container that is shipped to Banjul. In aggregate terms, looking at a minimum volume of 60,000 containers per year, it would mean roughly about $12 million surcharge on the economy. And the way that is translated is into higher retail prices of goods. So yes, the congestion has negative consequences, and also the greatest of the negative consequences is where cargo gets diverted to neighboring ports. Because ships can call to their neighboring port maybe faster. Once they come to Banjul, it takes longer. So that's why in shipping, mostly turnaround time also affects the business, because business transaction is all about volume and speed. Because if you can turn around faster, it means you have more transactions, and it means more business and less cost. So yes, the congestion we are aware, and it's basically caused by the capacity constraints we have in Banjul. The cargo volume has outgrown the facility. This has been identified in the business model that was developed for Banjul for 2019 to 2023. And it was identified that if no investment is realized in the physical infrastructure, we stand the threat of losing cargo to neighboring ports. And that is what we have been experiencing recently. Thus, the more need to urgently go into this investment for improvement of the infrastructure.
Thank you. My question is just the 20% that you're going to be getting from this project. Even though you say that the partners are the ones investing all the money, but don't you think that is too small? Like if I'm getting, let's say 10,000 and getting the 8,000 giving you 2,000, isn't that too small?
We don't consider it small or big, because the equity sharing is based on a financial model, depending on the level of investment of the parties, because it's a shareholding agreement. What we've managed to commit the concessionaire is that the business model that was developed in Banjul, it was written in the RFP that the value of the assets and the level of investment required, $131 million, to satisfy the 20-year demand forecast. It was in the model showing with the investor is to get 4% of the gross revenues that will accrue to the business without having to invest. Our physical assets, our land, fixed assets, are not used by the investor as collateral for to raise the capital that is required for the project financing. And there's a lot of other economic benefits to the country in terms of the increased competitiveness that will make the cost of doing business in Banjul cheaper. So those are the aggregate benefits we look at. And as a country, you get handed back and improved infrastructure at the end of the concession period without having to put in any financial contribution in terms of the investment. So the investor was made to be aware and accept the fact that you are coming to a port facility, in as much as we are not doing any financial contribution. There's a business that is ongoing. So in finance, project finance, now it's evolving. It's very innovative these days. People can calculate sweat equity. Like even the future cash flows can be discounted and a value placed on them. And these are the aggregates that we use to calculate the 20% equity. And to be realistic, there are people who are of financial background, and they are more experts in this area. But we can tell you with certainty that it was not easy to even commit to this 20%, where you have a huge investment, and there's going to be debt financing. Probably, if it's a 30-year concession, according to the model, in the first 12 to 15 years, there will not be a positive net income. Then during the later years of the concession, you see the revenue streams growing. And then also your 4%, gross earnings would also increase. And then if the net income also increases, you get paid 20% of the dividend. So these are the economic benefits to show that the 20% equity that we hold as a government, it's a fair deal compared to the lack of financial contribution, and also the asset we get delivered at the end of the concession period. So those are the aggregate benefits. By and large, we believe, according to our own assessment, that the 20% equity that we get as a shareholder is a good deal for the GPA and indeed for the country. Thank you, Mr. Fadera, for that question. The sandbar in the channel to Banjul, specifically located between what we call buoys number 2 and 3, restrict the size of vessels that can go to 9.5 meters, as I said. So a survey was done just recently, last month. And from the results, it came out that we need to dredge about 4.6 million cubic meters at a rate of about 7 euros per cubic meter. You're talking about more than 20 million euros to achieve the depth of 11 meters at only a critical spot in the channel. So yes, the need is there. That's the main constraint in Banjul. But it's a matter of prioritizing the investment to what is required, because we have a lot of challenges. It's one thing to dredge the channel to 11 meters, but it's another thing also to have the support infrastructure that will be able to accommodate these big vessels when they come, because some of these 12-meter draft vessels are coming gearless, like without crane. So to service them efficiently, you need, or even to service them in the first place, you need what we call shore crane. These are ship-to-shore cranes, and those are not available in Banjul. So it's a matter of trying to prioritize our need. So what we...
So meaning it's not the only sandbank that is stopping them from coming, but the facility is not there?
No. Yes. But I'm saying that why the decision to relocate the port was taken, one of the major considerations was the physical restriction coming into Banjul with the lack of adequate space and the lack of the right equipment and the investment in the digitalization. So those were the constraints. But the channel itself, what is peculiar about the channel also is that it maintains its depth, because the channel was last surveyed according to information when you have the Admiralty chart, they call it, 608 or 609. And this was done, I understand, last time it was done was during the colonial days, in 1948, thereabouts, according to information. But since then, the channel has maintained its depth, meaning that it doesn't change in terms of the configuration. So what we believe that if it is dragged to 11 meters, it will still maintain that 11 meters for a very long time. So our capacity to handle bigger, deeper draft vessels will also increase. But it has to be weighed against the combination of other challenges that we have on the side of the reception facility. So now what we have decided consciously as a management is to dredge the wharf areas. And that is a contract that is already being implemented with a local company to increase the depth alongside the wharves to allow deeper draft and create more accommodation to take care of the current congestion. But by and large, investing in maintenance dredge, apart from that is what we call capital dredging, to dredge it to 9 meters from 9.5. But you will need recurrent maintenance dredging to keep the water depths around the Banjul estuary to an acceptable level. And from our experience, every other year we spend nothing less than 2 million euros in dredging contracts to maintain those depths. So these are things that add up to justify the investment in a new deep sea port where some of these challenges can be addressed in a more sustainable manner. Ride on the back of existing protocols and say we are very grateful for the level of interest you've shown. I can say virtually all the media houses in the country are here with us today. It shows how committed and how important you are as a partner called the fourth estate in the socio-economic development of this country. By providing the right information that is required by the population to know, because this is a very important project for the whole country. And excuse our missteps for not having engaged you first before anybody else. But like Sunkaru said, it's a process, and life itself is a learning curve. We learn from each other. And this is one lesson that I will definitely take away, that in future, any outreach program, start with the media, because it is very important. But just to reassure you, Mr. Fadera, that all of these engagements, they were also covered by media. So in a sense, the media are our partners, because when we started with our staff, it was televised and it was recorded. And all of the comments that we receive, we will now fan back and try to put them in a sort of a report, concretize everything. Take all the comments and then provide you a feedback, because this is an ongoing process. And the opportunity we have is that the contract is effective in January. So valid observations, comments, suggestions are still relevant to be on board to the concession agreement. And my people taunt me at times that they've started this engagement a lot of times meeting equally important people in this country and sectors and municipalities. But Madam Binta told me the last time, taunting me, that the first engagement I attended was with the dock workers, and this was done, I think, sometime last week. The second engagement I attended was with the National Assembly, and I'm here today with the media. So they told me that, well, you are selecting the ones that you appear in person. So just to show that we understand the important role you play as partners. Because without you, we cannot do this project, because people need to know what is happening. And they can only know through the media. That's why we value this relationship. And be rest assured, we have to excuse some of our misgivings. And we err because we are human. But together, if we harness the potential that is in every one of us and strive for the positive energy, I can say that the expectations are that the project will be beneficial to the country as a whole, because it will open up the whole country. And the generations yet to come will look back in hindsight, and we will rejoice in memory for having participated in this transformative agenda. Once again, thank you. And
yoddu sa xat te quality jasna ñoo yor seen cumbukaay tur day uyu borom jasna pire sa ko bëggee fii si biir Gambia bi dawal foofu sa quality jasna your number one stop shop. Ana sama jigéen ñi dama bëgg ngeen jox ma seen nopp garme yi ndaxte quality jasna amal nañ leen ay til yu toj daala poos abaya yu yiiw waaye it amal nañ leen ay boreda yu rafet boreda yoo xam ne pour góor ñi la ak pour jigéen ñi. amal nañ leen body scrub yi nga xam ne nii dafay defar seen yaram bam nice white fàttewuñ fa diw yi. Ana sama jeeg yu pare yi quality jasna amal nañ leen fa andi cuuraay yu neex house spray ak bépp xeetu baax pour seen biir néeg. dama ne atum ren ji ku sa jëkkër mere ku ne yow la neex ndaxte quality jasna ñëw na si dëkk bi pour defar sëy yi. makeup artist yi bàyyi leen gannaaw ñu ngi leen fa amal ay makeup product yu quality waxu leen léegi nii foofu sa Westfield jàkkaarloog monument bi wala nga jokkoo quality jasna si 250 0124 ak quality jasna taaral sa bopp taaral sa néeg waaye it bégal sa alaaji aas.